All right, today we're going to go through the Jefferson presidency. Thomas Jefferson in what eventually becomes known as the White House. It wasn't called the White House back then. It was called the Presidential Palace. But regardless, Jefferson goes into the presidency in March 1801 after the November 1800 elections that the Republicans basically swept. They knocked Federalists out of office in huge numbers. So the Republican Party comes into Congress also with majorities. So you have a Republican-dominated House of Representatives, Senate, and executive branch presidency. Thomas Jefferson called this the Revolution of 1800 because he said that the people have risen up and have rejected the Alien and Sedition Acts, Hamilton's financial scheme, the whole Federalist Party platform that Hamilton had built up and largely had gotten implemented in the 1790s. So Jefferson says this is where the good, honest, kind of working class type small farmers went out to vote and threw Republicans into office in order to undo the stuff that Hamilton had created and Hamilton's party had created. So Jefferson called the elections a revolution in and of itself. It wasn't a violent revolution, it was a revolution of voting. The people went out and chose a different party to lead the country. And the Republican ideology is pretty clear and had been for quite a long time by that point. And so this is really rehashing what we've already talked about over the past few days. The so-called Yeoman Republic ideology. The ideology that political power should be vested in the average working class person, and because most people were farmers back then, Jefferson specifically talked about the small-time landowners. The small-time farmer who owns one or two or just a few acres to himself and his family, who goes off and works the land, raising the food that society eats to survive. And he said that these small-time farmers do all the really valuable work in society. So Jefferson portrayed himself and his party as supporting the interest of the common working class people. And he defined the Federalist Party and Hamilton's ideology as doing the exact opposite, basically of accumulating wealth and power for the rich, the big landowners, the bankers, the stockbrokers. And Jefferson and his party, throughout the whole 1790s, had put forward the question to the American voting public. Who do you want running this country? Who do you want to put in power? Who do you trust? Do you trust the average citizens? The average working people? Or do you want to trust the bankers to run the place? And Jefferson said that over and over again. And that was his party's ideology. He put that question to the American voting public. Who do you trust most? Which group do you trust most to run the country for the benefit of as many people as possible? And run the country with a certain amount of equality. And what we would today call economic justice. So Jefferson advertised his mistrust and, in fact, his deep hatred of commerce, big business, giant corporations, basically, of his time. He had a deep distrust of their interests because he said they're only in it for the money. He had a deep distrust of big-time commerce, big trade, big companies. He had an even deeper distrust of stockbrokers, speculators, investment-type people who look for undervalued things to buy, lands or stock in certain companies or certain businesses or factories or whatever you're talking about. The investment class who look for undervalued things to buy up, invest their money in and build up that business or the value of that land or whatever it is, build it up and then sell it at the peak of its value and take a lot of cash for themselves. That was called speculation, and it's still called speculation today. We mostly see that kind of speculation in, at least recently, in the housing market and in the stock market. The idea that you're not going to buy houses because you view this house as inherently valuable and useful for society in some way. You're buying it because it is undervalued and you may be able to make a lot of money off reselling it at some point in the future. And the same thing with the stock market. Now, most people go into the stock market, when they go to buy stock in a company, do not make that decision based on how healthy the company is or how much money they can make as a dividend. If you buy a piece of the company, you should get a piece of the profit. Most stockbrokers do not think about that very much. They think about, if I buy this stock in this company on Monday, if the stock goes up over the next few days, how much can I sell it for to make profit? Does that make sense? So this is called in general speculation, and Jefferson hated it, because he said it doesn't really do anything for the real world economy. The people who merely sit at a desk and buy stock or buy land, they just kind of sign documents and move paper around. They're pencil pushers. They don't do any actual physical work. They don't create anything. They don't build anything. So Jefferson said that those people aren't trustworthy. They're just in it for money. So we should trust the people who are actually going off and putting their hands into the ground and raising the food that society depends on to survive. And Jefferson hated the idea that certain individuals and companies built up a whole lot of wealth on paper in checking accounts or with paper money. He says that that doesn't create real value. That those people are basically the leeches of society. They're taking the wealth of society and keeping it for themselves, even though they're not actually doing any physical work. So he called paper wealth, wealth in bank accounts and whatnot, abstract wealth, like wealth that's kind of floating out there in theory somehow. But you're not actually creating anything. You're not building anything. You're not, in his mind, growing anything that helps the rest of society. Therefore, your wealth, your financial superiority, your financial dominance isn't really connected to anything physical in a real world kind of sense. So he had a deep hatred of those kinds of things. And he had a deep hatred of debt because it was attached to banking systems. And it was attached to investment and speculation. And he had a deep distrust of national debt, because usually if your government borrows money, they don't usually borrow money from the average people. They borrow money from wealthy investors. They're the ones who have the cash to give, to loan. So he hated the idea of national debt. He hated the Hamilton scheme of building up national debt to build up a large amount of money that Hamilton wanted to use in a lot of ways to reinvest in big businesses. Jefferson views this as an evil system. He said this is the kind of system that had corrupted and destroyed British politics. His accusation is that basically the bankers and the stockbrokers took control of the British government throughout the 1700s. And he said that they create a worldwide empire that is inherently oppressive and unequal, and that the British are really the scourge and the source of evil in the world. And he defines the United States, the new United States, as being a kind of new, pure politics. Politics of equality, where the average citizens get to choose their government leaders by voting. Which, at this point in human history, just did not really occur. The United States is basically one of the only democracies in the whole planet. Everything is run by kings and dictatorships at that point. So Jefferson has this vision of the United States being a much better political system than any other that existed in the world at this time. And he wants to guard that politics, that democracy, from the inherent corruptions that he sees that he thinks has created the corruption and really the fall of the British government, from a good thing down to being controlled by just the rich. So does all that make sense? I mean, we've gone over all this before, right? So that's his long-term ideology, and he very much hates Hamilton's proposals, Hamilton's ideas having at least good relations with Britain, because why would you want to have good relations with the source of evil on the planet? Jefferson's idea is to keep the United States a kind of farming population where they make their own stuff and they don't have to have much relations with especially the European imperialist powers. Jefferson also has this large fear of a standing army. Standing army is an army that is built up even though the country is not fighting any wars. We call these peacetime armies today. And remember, in the height of this fear of war with France that we talked about last time, the United States had started building up an army of 50,000 soldiers. And Jefferson was very afraid of that. He said, why do we need that large of an army if we're not fighting? So when the Republicans go in, they immediately start reducing the size of the U.S. military, especially the army, the land armies. He also cut funding for the U.S. Navy as president and reduces the U.S. Navy to basically being a Coast Guard system, and refuses to give funding to build naval boats, warships, that can sail any more than a few dozen miles off the coast of the United States. Why do you think he does that? What is he looking to avoid?
Partnerships.
Yeah, he's looking to avoid battles. He doesn't think that the United States should be trading with Europe, so what's the point in building up a gigantic U.S. Navy to sail across the Atlantic Ocean all the time? So he takes this ideology and he puts it into effect as president, and it's very clear that he does that. He cuts funding for the U.S. Army, reduces the Army back down to about 5,000 or so soldiers. He does fund the creation of West Point. So he does also have this balancing idea in his own mind that, yes, the United States has to have a certain amount of professional soldiers, officers trained in colleges in tactics and strategy and how to win wars, how to win battles. But he is very leery of creating a large army unless war breaks out. So what happens if the United States is invaded and it doesn't have a very large army or even much of a navy that even exists on any level? What does Jefferson plan on for the defense of the nation if the U.S. doesn't have an army and it gets invaded? What happens if France invades? What does he want to rely on? Any ideas? Yeah, he wants to rely on the farmers. He points at the American Revolution and said, the British invaded America, conquered all the major cities, won nearly all the major battles, but they didn't win the war because the American population refused to surrender. They refused to be occupied. They refused to give in. And the farmers put down their farming tools and picked up guns and went off to defend the nation. And that's what Jefferson wants to rely on in the future. He says we don't need a gigantic army constantly training in the United States, because if we're invaded, the people will rise up again and they will throw out the invaders, just like had happened during the American Revolution. A more cynical person would point at Jefferson's idea and say, well, he kind of forgets the fact that the United States took, the Americans took 6 years of hard fighting to actually win the war, and it was a very kind of even close thing in the end. And that was a pretty miserable experience for most American people. That's one major criticism of his ideas. But he advertises that idea, and he says that if the people are free from tyranny in the United States, and the people don't have to worry about being arrested for small, little political ideas or a complaint or anything like that, then the people will be willing to rise up and support their government in a national emergency. So he gives a pretty logical system of national defense, even as he's cutting military funding. Another major flaw in this, especially military policy, is what if something happens in another part of the world that impacts, say, the U.S. economy or U.S. society? One of the problems he builds up is that the U.S. military will not be large or strong enough to do what military historians call project power to other parts of the globe, to send U.S. military force to another place to do something that U.S. government may say is in American interests. And that problem rises up very quickly after he becomes president. After they reduce the size of the army, the U.S. shipping industry has a huge problem with international piracy. Pirates literally start attacking American-owned ships, American business, boats that are sailing around the Atlantic. They get attacked all over the place because there's no U.S. Navy to defend them out in most of the Atlantic. So that's a major foreign policy problem going forward. And what does Jefferson do to overcome that problem? Does anyone know? Number one, where do the pirates come from? Does anyone know this history? Heard of this at all? They're called the Barbary Pirates. They come from North Africa in a place that we today call Libya. So President Jefferson's solution to that problem is to literally send in the Marines. And he launches an invasion of the North African city called Tripoli to destroy the pirates in their own place. And if you ever listen to, I think it's the official song of the U.S. Marines, the one they sing all the time. One of the first lines in the song is, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli," because this was the first major U.S. foreign policy invasion of another place under the constitutional government. So even as he's shrinking the size of the military, he is using it to try to impact international politics and international economics. So questions about any of this so far?
Right now, were we in a national debt when Jefferson was in office?
Yes. The United States government under Congress had used Hamilton's financial scheme to go into debt to start borrowing money because they wanted to get together a bunch of money to reinvest in businesses and grow the U.S. economy. It was not a gigantic debt, nothing like what we have today. I mean, Hamilton himself probably would have been horrified at what the U.S. national debt is today. And Hamilton specifically said that you can only have a national debt as long as it doesn't become a burden to tax revenues, a burden through interest rate payments. And the U.S. interest payments on the national debt today is a large chunk of government spending, one of the largest chunks of government spending. So yes, the U.S. is in debt at this point. But it's very, very small scale compared to what we have today. I mean, even what the United States had 30 years ago is small scale to what we have today, if you ever look at the national debt numbers. Does anyone know what the United States national debt was in 1980? $1 trillion, just under $1 trillion. Does anyone know what it is today?
74?
No, 16, not 74. 74 is a gigantic number. But $16 trillion, give or take. They don't even know the exact number. It's somewhere around 15 or 16. So just in the past 30 years, we've gone from $1 trillion in debt going all the way back to the 1830s. That accumulated debt, 150 years, give or take, was $1 trillion. And in the past 30 years, we've added about $15 trillion. So that's something, especially to think about as we go into these kinds of elections. That's a basic fact and a basic statistic that is just not mentioned in, say, the presidential debates, right? For those of you who watched them. And it's just not mentioned in any political campaigns or on the news or anything like that. So it's something to be very aware of. And in fact, when I looked up the numbers a few years ago, I was absolutely shocked. It didn't seem logical. And it isn't, but... So yes, the U.S. was in national debt. There's no doubt about that. But it wasn't a gigantic debt like we have today. Even 30 years ago, it wasn't a gigantic debt like we have today. And the past 30 years has been a very strange financial history.
Who are we in debt to?
Mostly ourselves. Yeah. Most of the national debt is owed to wealthy people in the United States and wealthy U.S. businesses that have bought up government bonds. There's a lot of these accusations that China owns all the national debt, or Chinese businesses. That's not true. They own somewhere around $1 trillion out of the 15 or 16 trillion. So all these fears of China sinking the whole U.S. economy, or China demanding all their debt payments immediately, and that would destroy the whole U.S. repayment system. Not likely when you look at the numbers, but it's possible, I guess. But it's also possible that a third-party presidential candidate might actually win the election. It's not very likely, but it's possible. 1 or 2% probability. That's major problems of today that are not discussed. But back to Jefferson. Jefferson also hated monarchies and advertised that for many decades before the 1800s. That is nothing new, so no one would have been shocked at that statement. Hated the kings and the dictators of the world, specifically the King of Britain. And loved the idea that the idea of revolution is spreading across the globe. I mean, he literally wanted all these societies to go into revolution against their kings and build up democracies for themselves. So Jefferson particularly hated Hamilton's economic ideas. He called it monarchism. And Hamilton was very frequently accused of wanting to bring a monarchy back to the United States and make someone the king of the United States or something. So that was a major kind of political shot against Hamilton. That was pretty common back then. One of the very interesting things about Jefferson is he constantly talked about liberty and freedom and democracy, but did not really closely identify or define his idea of what liberty means. Probably the closest you ever get is the Declaration of Independence, where he gives the idea of liberty. He says there are these natural liberties that the creative forces of the universe give to all living people, and he says that among them, some of the most important are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So he doesn't even give his complete list of all the liberties. He just says that amongst the many, some of them you might want to think about are life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So those are probably the three best defined instances of where he ever talks about liberty in any kind of defined sense. And even those definitions are pretty vague in a lot of ways. So Jefferson never really defined his idea about what liberty is, how liberty should be supported. He generally talked about liberty being the result of law and equality under the law. So no favoritism in court systems or anything like that, that everyone should follow the law and be punished for breaking the law equally, no matter how rich or poor or politically powerful or even enslaved in certain instances they are. Everyone should have to follow the law equally. But he also seemed to have this idea we have from his letters he wrote to friends and some kind of discussions he had, that sometimes when a national emergency arises, that sometimes the government has to go beyond the law, has to work outside of the law to protect the nation, protect the people. And coming from the Virginia landowning class, a lot of historians have said and have argued that Jefferson's idea of protection is based in the wealthy elite of society, that they are like the guardians of society. So whenever society is threatened, these kind of supposedly most virtuous and most honest big landowners and wealthy people should lead society in its own protection. And that sometimes you have to go beyond the law in doing that. So in like many of the other things that he discussed in his lifetime, Jefferson is a tricky type of person. It is very difficult to understand what he really believed at his core, because he said a lot of things and then in his own personal life did the exact opposite. He said he hated slavery, he wanted to get rid of slavery, but he owned slaves. He said that the law and liberty should be the highest kind of most important thing for society, but then again he argues that sometimes government has to go beyond the law in certain national emergencies. He says he supports the common working class farmer, but he wasn't a common working class farmer. He never really seemed to have actually planted anything in his lifetime. He sat in his house while he had others doing that field work. So Jefferson is often viewed as a dichotomy and a very confusing type of person. He often says one thing and does another. So kind of inconsistent in his daily life. So that's the whole ideology that Jefferson proposes, that he discussed, that he campaigned on, and that the Republican Party campaigned on. And when they won the elections of 1800, they see themselves as the voice of the people. And so we went out to the voting public, we made these arguments, the people agreed with us and put us into office to actually do this stuff. And they do start doing it. And again, this is the presidential election result in 1800 that he calls the Revolution of 1800. This is when the people rose up, put the Republicans in to implement their policy ideas. And Jefferson claimed a very large mandate to actually do all this stuff because he won the presidency and his party took majorities in Congress. When you look at the actual vote counts, the percentage of the vote, he barely got over half. So, I mean, how much? He barely got over the needed amount of the electoral vote. So how much does he have this gigantic mandate to actually go and implement all this stuff? Historians have also questioned. But he claims it, and when he gets into office, he actually starts doing it. And there's not much question about that. So going into his domestic policies, and mostly regarding money, taxation, debt, what to do about that stuff. Jefferson had carved out his space as a direct opponent to everything that Hamilton had put into place in the 1790s. The banking system, the National Bank of the United States, the national debt, the support for manufacturing businesses, tax revenue going to support the growth of factory systems, factory businesses. The creation of at least commercial treaties with Britain. The rejection of treaties with France. U.S. assumption of state debts. I mean, the whole lineup of different policies that Hamilton had argued and gotten implemented in the 1790s, Jefferson is going to look to remove as much as he possibly can. And one of the major problems of this is that Hamilton did not just build up a system that gave out wealth or that supported the wealthy, the people who are already wealthy. The real genius of Hamilton's political system is he created an economic system that if you are an American and you want to gain wealth, if you want to rise to wealth from, say, the working class or the poor, you have to go through his system in one way or another. Through investing in bonds, buying up, loaning money to the government, getting interest payments back over time, by building factories and taking U.S. government subsidies. Most of the people who rise to wealth and power in the United States in the 1790s go through the Hamilton financial system. And because they went through it, they want to see it continue. Right? This is like the person who wins a marathon. They want more marathons to be run, right? Because that's where they gain their wealth and their fame. The people who win the marathon, or the quarterback who wins the Super Bowl, does not want to stop playing the game, right? Because that's when their wealth has ended. That's when their access to fame and power has ended. So they look to perpetuate the system in place. And the winners of an existing system almost always want to keep that system in place because that will keep their access to wealth, power, and fame. And the people who rose to wealth in the 1790s largely wanted to keep the Hamilton financial system in place because they were the winners of it. They won the game. And one of the final pieces that Hamilton tried to implement, didn't really get there all the way, was some kind of international, at least commercial treaty with Britain, if not an actual political treaty that declared the United States and Britain friends. Didn't completely get there by 1800, but it was one of his major policy points, one thing that he constantly argued needed to be done. And why did Hamilton think that? Because he said the U.S. economy is so fragile. It is so small, and 75% of U.S. international trade goes to Britain, that you have to keep the British happy. You have to be on their side. You cannot oppose them and piss them off, because if they get mad, they can sink and destroy the entire U.S. economy just by their own decision. So Hamilton said, we need to be friends with Britain to allow the U.S. economy to continue to grow. Once it gets big and strong enough to actually be independent, then we can start, having arguments with the British, but not here at this early moment. And these are the things that Jefferson will largely try to undo as president. And the Republicans view it as their political mission going into office in 1801 to completely remove, repeal, and destroy the Hamilton system. Number one of the big things they campaigned on in 1800 was the immediate repeal and removal of the Alien Sedition Acts, and they accomplished that pretty quickly. The Alien Sedition Acts were very unpopular, especially the Sedition Act. So they repealed that one pretty quickly in the first few months of being in office after March 1801. Jefferson also argues that tax rates should be lowered throughout the entire United States, virtually down to zero. And Hamilton was very worried about this. Hamilton wrote articles and gave speeches basically howling at this idea, saying that Jefferson's fiscal policies are going to bankrupt the U.S. government. And Hamilton puts forward the idea that if you want to lower the tax rate, at least keep some internal taxes on the books in case of a national emergency. That way you can gain money quickly. But Jefferson wanted to go through and repeal all those taxes, get rid of them completely, take them out of the law books, take them out of the tax code. Jefferson wants to rely on tariffs, taxes on imports from foreign places, as the major source of government funding. And because Jefferson is in general cutting the U.S. budget, especially military, Jefferson basically argues we don't need a whole lot of money to function, so we want to take internal taxes down to basically near zero and rely mostly on taxes on imports, taxes on foreign companies for the most part, as the funding for the U.S. government. But again, the question arises, what are you going to do in a national emergency? What if war breaks out and imports plummet? Then your revenue will plummet. Jefferson argues that if there's a national emergency, we will simply raise internal taxes on our own people. And he says again, the people will love their government so much because they have basically not been taxed at all. They have a small military. They get to vote for their leaders. That the American voting public is so supportive of what they view as a good, honest government, that when a national emergency rises, not only will the farmers be willing to put down their farming tools and go off to war to defend the nation, but they'll also vote and willingly accept higher tax rates to fund national defense in the event of an emergency. So again, Jefferson is pointing at the average people and saying, you are the good, honest people, and I trust you to respond well in the event of some kind of national emergency, especially a war. Another thing Jefferson wanted to do was repay the national debt. Pay it all off completely. And he laid out, and Congress laid out, a 20-year plan for paying off the entire national debt that had been accumulated in the 1790s. And again, we've already talked at length about the reduction in the size of the U.S. military. And they start doing these things point by point over the first few years of his presidency. So questions about any of those at all? Nope. Moving on. Okay, the two major people responsible for implementing a lot of this stuff, James Madison goes in to be Secretary of State. He will implement a lot of these ideas internationally. Secretary of State is basically the head U.S. diplomat. Has talks with foreign leaders throughout the world. And the Treasury Secretary is named Albert Gallatin. He was probably the most educated Republican Party member in economics. He was a member of Congress before, so he was in Congress voting against and arguing against Hamilton's whole financial scheme as it was being proposed piece by piece. And he was basically recognized as the Republican who knew enough about Hamilton's ideas to actually be able to destroy them. So he is promoted to be Secretary of the Treasury. And these two guys become two of the more famous administrators, leaders of the Jefferson administration going forward. Okay, so the Republicans have the presidency, and they have large majorities in both houses of Congress. So they're basically running the government. The Federalists can complain all they want, but they don't have enough votes to stop anything. The one source of Federalist Party power in the national government was in the court system, because Federalists had been basically the first three presidents. So when the court system was created in the first few years after 1789, President Washington got to appoint all the first judges into the court system, the first generation of judges. He had a blank slate. It was a brand new thing. As those judges started to retire in the late 1790s, so about 10 years later, give or take, President Adams, a much more dedicated Federalist Party member, got to appoint new judges to those vacancies, to those retirements, those places that were emptied by retirement. And Adams tended to appoint Federalist politicians and party supporters to those judgeships. And after he lost the 1800 election, in the couple days or so before Jefferson is inaugurated, we now know that Adams literally stayed up all night appointing Federalist Party members into the federal court system in order to keep as much Federalist Party power in the national government as possible, because the results of the election are already well known, and the Republicans are going to come into power. So Adams made a lot of so-called midnight appointments. He literally stayed up all night, the last night of his presidency, signing these documents constantly, putting these Federalist people into the judiciary. When the Jefferson administration comes in, they think that they're going to make all these appointments. Then they look at the stack of appointments that Adams had already assigned, and they get very angry. And the Republicans say, and Jefferson even says, this was an underhanded thing for the Federalist Party to do, to try to cling to power in the last place that they have any access to. So the Jefferson administration refuses to actually file those appointments and to actually put those people who were theoretically signed off on and appointed into the court system, to actually give them their appointment and send them into their new job. One of these appointed judges, because the Jefferson administration is literally dragging his feet as long as possible, is named Marbury, and he sues Jefferson in court to get his appointment fulfilled to begin his job as a judge. This guy Marbury, in the actual court documents, does not sue Jefferson personally. Instead, he sues the Secretary of State, Madison, and he files this lawsuit at the Supreme Court. And that eventually is his major mistake. This court case becomes known as Marbury v. Madison. It is filed directly at the Supreme Court. And the eventual decision by the Chief Justice, written by the Chief Justice, and gets a majority on the court, so this becomes a court decision itself, is that the Constitution does not give the Supreme Court the power of original jurisdiction. Only in certain instances. Trials of foreign ambassadors and judges and high political leaders. Those are the only place under the Constitution where the Supreme Court will hear the original case, the very first lawsuit. So the Chief Justice at this point comes out and says, the Constitution says we can only do this, this, and this. This lawsuit filed by Marbury should have been filed in one of the lower courts first. And if he wanted to take it to the Supreme Court, he had to appeal up through the chain of court system. So he says Marbury's mistake is that he filed the original lawsuit at the Supreme Court. Therefore, the lawsuit is void. The Constitution does not allow the Supreme Court to even hear that case in the first instance. It has to go through the lower courts first. So, and this appears to be a political deal made between Marshall and the Jefferson administration leaders. The Supreme Court decision will allow the Jefferson administration to keep continuing doing what it wants, which is basically delay these appointments, because Marbury loses the decision. So the Jefferson administration wins the court battle and will try to kind of make new appointments to the federal court system to get more Republicans in. So the Jefferson administration will theoretically have the power to drag its feet and try to deny those Federalist appointments that Adams had made. So they get the short-term win. But this case is seen as much more important for the far longer term, right up to today. This is where the Supreme Court puts in one of its major decisions, that the Supreme Court has the power of appeals, and that the Supreme Court is the highest appeal possible. And that whatever the court says about laws in the United States is the final decision. Therefore, the Supreme Court gets the power to declare laws unconstitutional. And it retains that power today, because it has the power of appealing lower court rulings. And that's why you see the Supreme Court is hugely powerful today. Those judges are not elected, and they serve until they either resign or they die. They cannot be knocked out of office by any political pressure. And they can decide virtually any law in the United States is unconstitutional. They have to justify it by writing an essay saying that the Constitution says that this law should not happen because A, B, and C reasons. And the Supreme Court does that fairly frequently. So the court is hugely powerful today. And again, unelected. So questions about the importance of this Supreme Court case in particular. What it does or what it has done for the long term. No, perfect clarity. Okay, I personally think that's a confusing one, but okay. The Republicans, though, were not done. They picked out especially one member of the Supreme Court, this guy Samuel Chase, who was a judge on the Supreme Court, who had gone around and given very controversial newspaper interviews and whatnot, where he said a lot of bad things about the Republican Party. He was very obviously a Federalist. So he had said some things that were very embarrassing to himself. The Republicans impeach this Supreme Court judge. They say that his refusal to follow what the Republicans want is basically a refusal to listen to the will of the people. Because the people have put Republicans into office through the recent elections, the 1800 revolution. So the Republican Party idea is that the people have spoken, so the Supreme Court should listen to the voice of the people. And as the Supreme Court starts consistently refusing to allow the Republicans to do certain things, the Republican Party gets mad at the Supreme Court, and they pick out this guy, probably one of the more extreme Federalist members of the court, try to make an example out of him, basically. They want to knock him out of his office so they can get a new appointment, and set an example for a lot of other judges, Federalist judges, that are looking to deny what the Republicans want to do politically. This starts off a national controversy and a national debate over the role of the court system and how independent it should be from political pressure. A lot of judges come forward and say that if we are going to enforce the law equally and without bias, that we cannot be pushed around by any kind of political opinions or political parties or political leaders or even elected leaders. That in order to have a just, equal society under the law, that the law has to be applied impartially regardless of political connections or favoritism or anything like that. So the trial of this Supreme Court judge goes on for a couple months. He is tried in the Senate, and eventually it's going to come down to a vote in the Senate about whether this guy is guilty of what the Constitution says are high crimes and misdemeanors against the government, and therefore should be removed from the Supreme Court, removed from office. Impeachment means just bringing the charges and having the trial. Whether or not he's found guilty is up in the air. And as this thing is publicized, the American population comes to understand that this is merely a Republican Party attempt to knock out their Federalist opponents. And the public starts to really turn against the Republican Party. And even though the Republicans had majorities in the Senate still votes that this judge is not guilty of any actual crimes. He said a lot of things in newspaper interviews and publicly, but those were not crimes against the Constitution that would demand his removal from office. The things he said was not bad enough. He didn't commit any actual crimes. And Jefferson Republicans had also won the election of 1804. Jefferson is overwhelmingly reelected into the presidency in November 1804. So this is just a few months after another Republican sweep of the elections. And the very fact that the public and even their own Republican senators now go back and hold this vote to not get rid of a Federalist judge is seen historically by a lot of observers, historians, as one of the first major kind of repudiations of a party that the people had just elected into office. You know, they just won the elections. They're theoretically very popular. But a lot of the population looks at this trial in particular and says, well, the party is now going a little bit too far. They're trying to claim too much power. So does that make sense? That's a small thing that often is also overlooked in history books and other history classes and whatnot. But this is a huge humiliation for the Jefferson administration. And this is a national embarrassment for the Republican Party in general. So questions about this at all? No. You guys are alive. Okay, I hope so. Otherwise you're going to start decomposing, start getting smelly soon. Okay, so that's a lot of the domestic stuff going on in the first few years of Jefferson in office and Republicans in power. Now I want to go to international foreign policy. Obviously, and Jefferson had talked about this repeatedly throughout his life since the 1770s, his goal is to separate the United States from Britain, to exert real political independence and political power, to reject Britain as an ally. Because again, he viewed British politics and the British economy as really the source of evil and oppression in the world. So Jefferson hated the British right down to his core, and that was pretty well advertised, and most people realized it, and wasn't a whole lot of gray area on that one. And he very much hated the fact that 75% of the U.S. economy is tied to Britain through foreign trade. and he wanted to figure out ways to make the American economy more independent of British trade. That was something that he and Hamilton very much agreed on. How to do that, they very much disagreed on. So President Jefferson often talked about the real world independence of the United States. And that independence has to be built up because politically they're not really independent because there's such a close economic tie. And here's a map of the United States in Jefferson's term. One of the major sources of especially economic problems for the United States is again the Mississippi River. The American population is moving west. They're starting to occupy and build farms in what was then called the Old Northwest, because it was the northwestern portion of the country out in what they called the Ohio Territory. There are a lot of still British forts in this area, so that's a kind of insult to the Americans. There's a large British colony in Canada just to the north. There's a large Spanish colony in Florida, all the way to the Mississippi River in the south. And Louisiana had gone back and forth between Spain and France since 1783. They signed treaties every once in a while. It changes hands pretty consistently. So in the 1780s, Spain largely dominated, the Spanish colony largely dominated the areas, especially getting closer to New Orleans, and dominated a lot of the lands that were theoretically on the U.S. map, was U.S. territory. So a lot of these areas are controlled by the Spanish military and Spanish populations. So they're controlled basically by the Spanish government, especially the port at New Orleans. And the Spanish had caused problems for Americans living in the West who want to put their farming goods on the river and sail them south to New Orleans to export them to the rest of the world. We've talked about that before, right? Yes? No? Yeah? Okay. That's good. The Spanish had basically raised tax rates on American shipping coming down the river and going into the port of New Orleans. Jefferson was very worried about that. You remember, Jefferson is a small-time farmer kind of supporter. So he views it as his mission to actually do something about that. He, at first, threatens Spain. He wants to gain control over Florida and a whole lot of this colony and gain control of New Orleans. So one of the first things he does in the early 1800s is he sends ambassadors to Spain and says, why don't you just sell us Florida? You guys there's not a whole lot of Spanish people actually in Florida. It's a pretty much empty colony. So why not just sell us the land? We'll pay you for it. And then Jefferson says, if you refuse to sell it to us, we're just going to build up an army and invade it and take it from you anyway. So there's a real military threat there, which is theoretically illegal, not a very good thing to do. Right around the same time, a leader in France rises in 1799 and takes control of the French revolutionary government. His name is Napoleon. And he pushes the Spanish around, forces the Spanish to sign a treaty, which basically turns over New Orleans and all of Louisiana back to French control. Here's a picture of France here in the revolutions. Napoleon, when he rose in 1799, had continued the wars against the other European powers. And Napoleon's important because he actually starts conquering Europe. He goes through, conquers the Germanies, conquers northern Italy, defeats Prussia and Austria repeatedly, tries to invade Britain, eventually invades all the way as far east as Russia and gets to Moscow by 1812 and pushes the Spanish around. So Napoleon is rising as a major international force, and he is conquering Europe piece by piece. So he is a real power broker. He is a tough negotiator. And he kicks the Spanish government around to the point he'll eventually put his own brother on the Spanish throne. So the Spanish will eventually get a French king again. But he retakes control of the Louisiana territory, including New Orleans. So when Jefferson wants to negotiate to buy the port of New Orleans to guarantee the right of American farmers to send their shipping through the city and through the port to the rest of the world, instead of going to the Spanish capital, now he has to send negotiators to Paris to talk to Napoleon. Picture here of Napoleon. So, a couple different images of what Napoleon presented himself to be. He eventually claims to be the Emperor of the French. So he's a military leader and probably the greatest military genius of his age. Not even probably, I mean, almost without doubt. I have never seen any arguments against that idea. So Napoleon is obsessed with power. Jefferson proposes to buy New Orleans from France at a very kind of lucky time for the United States. Napoleon is at this point at peace with Britain. They have a kind of ceasefire treaty, but he's gearing up to go back to war. So Napoleon needs money. He had plans to build New Orleans into a French capital city in North America and try to conquer the rest of North America, basically just like Europe, and turn it into a French empire in North America. But he says that's going to be too expensive and he needs money to fight in Europe. So he agrees to sell New Orleans to the American government for somewhere around $15 million. And when the negotiations happen, he says that he's not going to be able to do much with the whole Louisiana territory anyway. So when the American ambassadors come in and talk about buying just the port of New Orleans and some of the land around it, so the United States could kind of own that land and control it around the river, Napoleon says, well, for $15 million, I'll not just give you New Orleans, but I'll give you all of Louisiana. And the American ambassadors are absolutely floored by the deal. They didn't expect that. And they see this as a great deal for the United States. They sign that treaty immediately and send it back to Washington, D.C. The problem for Jefferson is that there's nothing in the Constitution that describes the president's power to actually buy land. So Jefferson feels conflicted. He wants to do it, but he doesn't know if he has the constitutional power to actually do it. His friends, especially Madison, convince him in several different ways to do it. Because number one, the president has the power to negotiate treaties, and this would theoretically be a treaty. And number two, and it appears to be the winning argument in Jefferson's mind, this is worth doing because, again, the government, to protect a nation, can sometimes go beyond the law. So Jefferson will argue, and Madison will argue, that this is a good thing to do even if it's not exactly precisely constitutional, because it will double the amount of land ruled by a democracy. So Jefferson says this is a good thing in world history, not just for the United States, but for the growth of democracy generally in the world. So this treaty goes to the Senate, and the Senate will debate it. The Republicans overwhelmingly will want to approve it because they view it as a great deal for the United States. And it becomes one of the probably most ridiculous lopsided land deals in all of human history. We're talking about millions of acres for just $15 million. And I think it eventually adds out to be something like $1.40 per acre. I mean, somewhere around there. I don't have to look up the exact number, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood. So this is a huge and pretty ridiculous deal that the United States is going to get. The Federalist Party, though, opposes the treaty. Does anyone want to guess why? Well, they have very little money, and that was one controversy. Now Jefferson is talking about borrowing money to actually pay for this deal, so his theory on national debt is starting to go out the window also. But not so much the money. The Federalists want national debt. Remember, they're favorable to that, so that's not their big complaint. They largely don't have a real major complaint. They look for any excuse they can possibly find to oppose the treaty. Why do they want to oppose it? Because Jefferson is the one who proposed it. He's the one who brought the treaty to Congress. So if this one goes through, the Federalist leaders understand that Jefferson will get the credit for it, and the Republican Party will get the credit for it. And this is going to be wildly popular in the United States amongst the voters. So the Federalists opposed the treaty purely for political reasons. They don't want to hand Jefferson great popularity, because then they figure we'll never beat the guy in an election. And remember, this is 1803. This is a year before the next presidential election. So the Federalists are now obstructing, or at least trying to obstruct, the Republicans from doing things that the Federalists know will be popular. And you still obviously see stuff like that going on. Opposition parties opposing certain ideas just because they want to humiliate the other party. So this one does go through, and Louisiana becomes a part of the United States. So the actual states that existed at this point are only getting out into kind of like Tennessee and Kentucky and those kind of other states. A lot of this is just open land. These are not states yet. This is just open territory. And for really the rest of the century, the United States will try to the government will try to figure out ways to convince farmers to move into those areas and occupy those places to really control it. I mean, at this point, 1803, it's just open land. It's just kind of wild frontier. And that leads us to this guy. Aaron Burr is a famous politician. Of the 1790s, he was a Republican Party member, Republican politician. He ran for president in 1800 with Jefferson at the same time. And under the original version of the Constitution, before it's changed, the Electoral College, the electoral members, got 2 votes for president. And it was basically viewed as you would cast 1 vote for president and 1 vote for who you wanted to be vice president. So in the first election in 1788, Washington was unanimously chosen. All the electors voted for Washington. Then there's a bunch of secondary candidates that people were voting on for vice president. John Adams got enough to become the vice president. Under the original Constitution, the person who got the most votes, the majority of the Electoral College, became president. The person who got the second most votes became vice president. And the same thing happened in 1792. Washington unanimously reelected. Then there's some debate about who should be vice president, so some people voted for other guys to be vice president. So Adams, again, was reelected vice president. Election of 1796. Now you have the major parties formed and active. Adams barely got a majority, so he became president. Who got the second most votes? Anyone remember? Jefferson. He was the second most popular. So in that administration, in a Federalist administration, Thomas Jefferson was actually the vice president of the United States for 4 years. Didn't really do much, but he was theoretically, or he was in fact, vice president, and theoretically involved in the cabinet meetings and everything. In the 1800 election, the Republicans run several candidates. It is very generally agreed that if you're voting Republican, you're going to vote for Jefferson to be president. And then there's some debate about who should be vice president. So eventually, Jefferson gets a very slim majority for president in 1800. Adams loses that election, but he actually gets the 3rd most votes for president, because Burr is also running. So everyone who voted for Jefferson to be president also voted for Burr to be vice president. They didn't want Adams in office at all. And in the 1800 election, it ended up being an exact tie for the presidency between Burr and Jefferson. Even though it was admitted that everyone was voting for Jefferson to be president, Burr to be vice president. Burr didn't see it that way. Burr becomes one of these very underhanded and kind of untrustworthy politicians. The Republican Party went to him and said, well, you're going to accept being vice president, right? And he said no. If you look at the actual vote count, we got the exact same amount. So under the Constitution, what happens when no candidate gets a clear majority and actually wins the election? Who gets to vote? Who determines who the president is? The House of Representatives. So all of Jefferson's fans that were in the House, they vote for Jefferson to be president. The Senate then chooses Burr to be vice president. And Burr never actually functions as vice president. He is so unpopular in his own party for even challenging, for even trying to become president in this kind of underhanded way, that he's basically kicked out of Washington, D.C. The Republicans hate him. So he goes back home to New York. Runs for governor in 1804. Hamilton is also in New York, and Hamilton has a pretty deep hatred for Burr. He basically views Burr as an idiot and untrustworthy. So Hamilton writes a whole bunch of newspaper articles and gives speeches and whatnot against Burr. And Burr loses the election for governor of New York in 1804 and blames Hamilton. I mean, Hamilton wrote some pretty nasty things about him. Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel. Pistols at dawn, that kind of stuff. And this is seen as a very macho thing, so if you're challenged, you basically have to accept, or you're kind of seen as a wuss in society. So Hamilton accepted the challenge and showed up at this secret meeting. This stuff is illegal. It was very normal for, if you're challenged to a duel, you actually show up, and you're seen as macho enough to actually show up that you don't have to actually kill each other. So usually when a duel happens, they count off their 20 paces. You heard of this stuff, right? And they get to take turns shooting at each other until one of them falls. So usually they flip a coin and say, okay, you get to shoot first. I'm going to stand here and wait to see if you hit me or not, and I'll take my turn. It was normal for both people in the duel to take their gun and point it way off to the side and pull the trigger because it was manly enough to actually show up to the thing. Hamilton got to shoot first, and he follows this kind of consistent pattern. He takes his gun. He doesn't really want to kill Burr, so he just shoots it off to the side. No threat to Burr at all. Burr takes his gun. Boom. Takes out Hamilton. So Burr hated Hamilton enough to actually want to kill him. And Hamilton dies a few days later. This stuff is illegal. This is murder. Burr is now an outlaw. So he flees New York, because if he's arrested, he's going to be put on trial for murder and possibly executed. So Burr has to leave New York, and where do people go back then if you're running from the law?
West.
Yeah, they went west into the open countryside where there just aren't that many law enforcement types. There's not that many police out there. So he runs to the west. He is unpopular now with Republicans for challenging Jefferson, and the Federalists hate him deeply because he murdered their party leader. So that's how Hamilton leaves the scene. And we'll skip past the trial of Chase in 1805. Let's see. Burr is now running around in the West trying to avoid being caught as much as possible. And Burr does an interesting thing at this point. He wants to become politically popular again in the United States. He is one of these politicians who wants to make a comeback. He makes contact with the official governor of Upper Louisiana. So a guy who was appointed by the U.S. government to basically have an army that's centered in St. Louis, the big city in Upper Louisiana. He has his own army. And Burr makes a deal with him. And to go back to the map pretty quickly, Louisiana is up here about midway up the Mississippi River. Burr goes to this guy and says, I have an idea. My idea is, let's take your army from St. Louis and we will march south along the Mississippi River and let's conquer New Orleans. And what is at this point American City. He wants to use the excuse of there's still Spanish people in the area and they're threatening to cause a revolution and try to reconquer Louisiana for Spain. Not really happening, but that's the excuse they want to use, their kind of PR campaign, their public relations idea. So Burr's idea is to march south and conquer New Orleans. His dream is to take the city and break away all of Louisiana from the United States and make it a different country. And New Orleans would be the new capital city of this new country. And of course, Burr would be its president. So he is looking to regain political power. And of course, he makes a deal with Wilkinson. I'll make you the head of the Louisiana Army, or whatever it would be called. He said that if that one doesn't fly in the United States, because obviously Washington, D.C. will resist this may be viewed as a bad thing amongst the American people, and maybe even the population of New Orleans may resist that. So Burr says if that doesn't work, we'll leave New Orleans and go east and invade the Floridas, the Florida colony of Spain, conquer it from Spain, and then sign a treaty and basically hand it over to President Jefferson as a new territory for the United States. So Burr thinks this is a win-win for him. He's either going to be president of a new country, or he is going to go east with an army, conquer Florida, and hand it over to the U.S. He says, either way, I'm going to reemerge in political power. Messengers are sent to President Jefferson. And it's pretty well indicated that Jefferson understood what was going to happen. At least with Florida, if not so much with New Orleans. Anyone want to take a guess at what the message that Jefferson sent to Burr and Wilkinson? Did he want to stop them?
Yeah.
Not so much. Jefferson implied that he would accept the invasion of Florida because Jefferson wants land. Jefferson wants as much open territory as possible for all those small-time farmers that he said he loved to go off and get their other couple acres. So Jefferson is using any tactic necessary. He's buying land, or he's going to allow a non-government invasion of land. He just wants to get control of more territory. So he implies that the United States government may accept the invasion of Florida if they do turn that territory over to the United States. It is very silent on New Orleans. So Burr and Wilkinson, feel very confident. They start marching south along the river. They get to New Orleans, and it appears that the general Wilkinson started to back away from the deal. Did conquer New Orleans, reduced it to martial law, so anyone in the city who complained about the conquest of the city were thrown in jail, probably to be silenced, to keep the kind of reality of what had happened from spreading and being well known in the United States. Yeah.
Who was the governor of Louisiana?
Of Lower Louisiana, I can't remember. I'd have to look that one up.
Was it on the previous slide?
No, he's the governor of the upper portion up here in St. Louis. Yeah. So there's another kind of government running down in New Orleans itself, and they get conquered. And this general starts throwing people in jail for complaining about it because, again, he doesn't want people telling newspaper reporters about what has happened. There seems to be a falling out between Wilkinson and Burr. Wilkinson starts sending messages that they're not going to separate Louisiana and start to create a new country, so Burr's pretty pissed off. Burr starts making movements toward invading eastward into Florida, then gives that up and basically runs back into the frontier again so he doesn't get caught. So the short of this is that Wilkinson will have to deal with the Jefferson administration about whether or not the President of the United States is going to allow this to happen. So Wilkinson's in hot water. Eventually, the United States government will go into New Orleans and free those people from jail and whatnot. But again, this is Jefferson basically revealing that he is trying to get control of certain valuable areas by any means necessary. He's even willing to make deals with a person like Burr, who had tried to knock Jefferson out of the presidency in order to get especially Florida. But that invasion never happened, so Florida remained part of Spain. It remained a Spanish colony. So questions about any of that stuff? And, Burr runs away and he lives on for another few decades and dies a very unpopular and bitter person.